No one could believe it. The statue, the very pillar of their household, was gone. Cries of despair filled the air as everyone shouted that this must be a bad dream. Hans knew that Lacan's statue had still been there until yesterday and wondered where it could have gone. He looked around but quickly dismissed the thought, realizing that finding Simon was more important. One of the knights approached Hans in a panic, shouting that there was a problem. Hans, stuttering, asked what it was, but then immediately changed the subject, shouting that it didn't matter right now and demanding to know Simon's whereabouts. The knight, equally flustered, replied that he thought Simon had left when security was at its weakest. Hearing this, Hans fell to his knees in frustration, shouting at their young lord, asking what he was scheming. Meanwhile, in a forest, Simon was in a carriage with Lacan's statue. The driver, glancing back, asked if he could pose a question without being rude. Simon agreed, asking the man who he was again. The driver laughed awkwardly, asking if Simon had already forgotten. He then introduced himself as Philip, explaining that he served as Simon's guard knight. Philip hesitated but eventually asked if Simon truly intended to sell the statue. Simon replied affirmatively, adding that the statue should fetch quite a bit if melted down. Philip, horrified, reminded him that the statue carried 500 years of history. Simon raised his foot threateningly, causing Philip to recoil in fear. He then asked Philip if those 5 centuries of history had ever fed him. Philip protested, saying that selling the statue wouldn't be enough to repay their debts. Simon assured Philip that the statue was only a small part of his plan. Relieved that there was a plan, Philip said he was sure everyone would understand, as long as the debts were repaid. Philip then asked about the plan, and Simon seriously replied that he intended to use the money from selling the statue to gamble and win the 30,000 pesos. Philip was shocked and abruptly stopped the carriage. Shouting, Philip asked what would happen if Simon lost all the money instead. Simon dismissively asked why Philip had come with him if he was only going to lecture him. Philip reminded him that it was Simon who had dragged him out at dawn, and if he had known about this plan, he wouldn't have come. Philip nervously suggested turning back now and begging for forgiveness, saying they could come up with a new plan. Simon scoffed, calling Philip an idiot, and pointed out that if they returned, he would have to explain why he had taken their great predecessor's statue. He added that if he confessed it was because he needed money for gambling, the household would never forgive him. He was certain he'd be permanently expelled if he went back now. Philip was stunned, but Simon continued, speculating that they might not be able to expel him since he was still Simon. Instead, he guessed Philip would be the one punished and cast out, which made Philip shake in fear. He laughingly told Philip to choose wisely, asking him to think about what was better for him. He asked Philip if he wanted to become a penniless vagrant or a hero who would bring honor to the household. He ordered Philip to decide. Philip, stuttering, replied that they would keep going as planned. Simon laughed, praised Philip, and told him they should just go for it. Philip cursed under his breath, remembering that he'd heard rumors about Simon's personality changing after waking up from his coma. But now, he thought Simon was practically the devil himself. Later, they arrived at the dock, where the captain shouted that they only had 5 minutes until departure. Philip hesitated, asking if they were really getting on. Simon retorted by asking if they should just turn back instead. Stammering, Philip replied that they should board the boat. Once they were both on, the captain rang the bell, signaling and it began its journey to another city. That night, they arrived at the harbor city of Lamer. There, they sold the historical statue of hero Lacan. Philip handled the money from the sale, but asked the buyer if that was really all he was paying for such an important statue. He emphasized that it was the statue of the hero who saved the world. The buyer replied that he would go out of business if he paid more. Simon called Philip, ordering him to guide the way. As they walked away, Philip muttered that they could have gotten more for the statue, but Simon dismissed his complaint, saying it was good enough. He then commented that Lamer had certainly changed, prompting Philip to ask if he had been there before. Simon replied that he had, though only briefly, and it wasn't like this back then. He explained that years ago, it was nearly impossible to reach Lamer because of a kraken, making it little more than a deserted island. Reflecting, he realized it really had been 500 years, and remarked that coming to Lamer was a good idea. Philip, now excited, thanked him and added that he didn't know how long it had been since Simon last visited. But Lamer was now very different. He explained that the city was now the second largest in the southern region of the empire, constantly changing due to its growth. He reiterated that it used to be an island no one could reach easily because of the kraken and other sea monsters. However, with advancements in magical engineering and weaponry, The area had become far more populated. Philip then mentioned that, naturally, the gambling scene in Lamer was enormous, and nervously asked if Simon was confident about gambling. Simon replied that if he wasn't confident, he wouldn't have come. Moments later, they arrived at a massive gambling hall. Simon told Philip they should head inside, but Philip shouted for him to wait, saying he needed to take a few deep breaths first. Simon asked what Philip was so afraid of. Philip, still nervous, asked how Simon could stay so calm and if he even knew how to win at the games. Simon confidently replied that he had an idea and assured Philip that when it came to gambling, attitude was everything. Minutes later, Simon was seated at a card table. His opponent smirked and remarked that things weren't looking good for him, laughing as he announced yet another win. The opponent asked if Simon wanted to continue, leaving him sweating profusely and speechless with worry. His opponent laughed and remarked that luck was smiling on him today. Simon replied that it was fine since ability was also a part of luck, which made his opponent laugh harder. The opponent told him he was certainly generous and added that it was an honor to play a game with such a cool Simon. However, noticing he had no coins left, the opponent suggested ending the game. Simon confidently replied that they could keep going and ordered Philip to exchange all their remaining money for more coins. Philip protested, shouting that they couldn't risk it, because if they lost it would be over. Simon snapped at Philip not to talk back and to bring the coins. The opponent observed this exchange, thinking that Simon was agitated and that his own luck was unbeatable today. Simon placed all his coins on the table and declared that he would wager his entire fortune, going all in. Philip, watching nervously, thought the family was doomed. The opponent asked if he was serious, admitting that the stakes made him nervous since this was his first time playing such a big game. Still, he said he'd be fine with it. Simon calmly replied that being anxious wouldn't change the results. The opponent signaled to the lady behind him and praised Simon for his impressive composure before asking if they should reveal their cards. He confidently revealed his triple eights and shouted excitedly that the goddess of luck was on his side. As he reached to collect the coins, Simon stopped him, reminding him that they hadn't checked his cards yet. Simon then laid down an ace, king, and queen, revealing a royal flush. He told the opponent that, surprisingly enough, he had these cards. The opponent was stunned and shouted that it made no sense. Simon smirked and said, "Aren't those sudden reversals the joy of gambling?" He reached out to shake the opponent's hand, calling it an enjoyable match. Philip cried in relief, shouting that he always believed in Simon. Suddenly, the opponent slammed his fist on the table in anger. He accused Simon of cheating, claiming there was no way he got those cards without tricks. Simon calmly asked if he meant having people behind him to relay his cards. The opponent froze in shock, wondering how Simon knew. Simon continued, pointing out that all the nearby spectators were the opponent's subordinates secretly passing cards. He explained that he'd noticed their scheme early on and had marked the cards with mana. Manipulating them was simple for him, given his experience controlling a golem army. He concluded by saying that for someone like him, switching cards was a trivial task, making it easy to win without resorting to fancy tricks. Simon ordered the opponent to acknowledge his loss. However, the opponent declared that the business was over and signaled his men to teach Simon some etiquette. The opponent's men drew their weapons, and Simon sighed in frustration, muttering about how people hadn't changed in 500 years. Gathering his magic power in his hand, he challenged them to attack. As the men rushed him, Philip shouted for Simon to duck and swiftly slashed the attackers. Philip then asked how they dared draw their swords against the sole heir of the Lacan family, warning them that it meant they were prepared to risk their lives. The opponent, now terrified, admitted his guilt and begged for mercy. Philip, enraged, shouted at him to shut up and demanded to know how he dared harm Simon. Simon watched in amazement as Philip effortlessly defeated the attackers and thought to himself that Philip wasn't bad after all. Later, Philip carried a huge bag of money and remarked on how heavy it was, estimating that it was definitely more than 10,000 pesos. Simon agreed, glancing back at Philip and thinking that although he'd once seen Philip as just a porter, he was far more talented than expected. Reflecting, he thought the day's earnings weren't bad, but acknowledged that causing chaos at the gambling house would make it harder to visit others. He asked Philip if there were other ways to make money besides gambling houses. Philip thought for a moment and suggested the Gigant Arena. Curious, Simon asked what it was. Philip explained that, much like the human combat arenas of the past, Gigant arenas featured matches between gigants. Depending on the match, the or more. Intrigued, Simon considered the gigants, suspecting they were developed with golem magic. He thought this might help him predict the outcomes of matches. Philip confidently told him to trust him, explaining that he had been a top student at the Imperial Military Gigant Academy. Simon nodded and told Philip to lead the way, prompting Philip to cheer and ask for more credit. As they walked, they heard the sounds of knights beating someone and shouting at their victim to stay in their place. The knights warned the child, whom they were repeatedly kicking, that he would listen only after he died. Philip was furious to see the knights abusing a young child. He clenched his teeth in anger, thinking about how some things had decayed and rotted even more over the 500 years that had passed. Just as he was about to shout at the knights to stop, a voice interrupted him. A woman commanded the knights to stop immediately. They turned, angry, and demanded to know who she was. The woman stepped forward and asked if they weren't the royal guards, supposed to protect the subjects. She chastised them for wielding violence against a child, asking if only nobles were considered subjects. Simon stood in stunned silence, shocked to see that the woman looked exactly like Katerina. She continued, shouting that even children had the right to protection, leaving the knights frozen in disbelief. The knights told her that even if she was a princess, there was no point in resisting, as the count himself had issued the order. They asked if she understood how restless the people had become due to the influx of refugees. She responded by asking them if they truly believed that locking people up like cattle in an environment unfit for living was the right thing to do, which shocked them even more. She stepped forward and addressed the knights, declaring that these were innocent children who had lost their nation and families. If there was guilt to be assigned, she said, she should be the first to bear it. Raising her voice, she proclaimed that before she was the princess of the Volga kingdom, she was one of the refugees seeking exile. One of the knights, clearly frustrated, told her that her defiance would only cause trouble. He added that they weren't doing this because they wanted to, but because they were following the count's orders. Philip, observing the escalating situation, whispered to him that things were getting serious and asked if they should intervene. He, however, replied by asking Philip if he knew who the woman was. Philip confirmed that he did, explaining that she was Princess Reina of the Volga kingdom. He said she was famous for her disregard of noble etiquette and for standing up for the common people. Philip admitted he didn't know much more, only that her kingdom had fallen into ruin, and he never expected to see her in such a place. Hearing Reina's name confused him further. No matter how he looked at her, she was unmistakably Katerina. He wondered if Katerina had reincarnated, as he had, and how she could look exactly the same after all this time. The knights grabbed hold of Reina, apologizing but insisting they couldn't allow her to continue. They explained that if they let her defiance go unchecked, they would be the ones punished. One knight began pulling her away, while another restrained the child. Reina shouted at them, demanding to know what they were doing. The knights yelled back for her to stop interfering. Her cries of pain pierced the air, and he snapped, launching his fist at the knight and shouting for him to get his filthy hands off her. He punched the knight repeatedly, consumed by rage, thinking that even after all this time, no matter how the world changed, filth like this would never disappear. Reina grabbed his arm, pleading with him to stop and telling him there was no need to go so far. He halted, realizing what he was doing. Another knight appeared, sword drawn, calling him a fool. The knight demanded to know how he dared attack a guard, accusing him of defying imperial law. Philip stepped in, pointing his blade at the knight's neck and asking if imperial law mattered more to him than a life. The knight cursed Philip, calling him a bastard, and retreated with his comrades, shouting that they would make them regret it. Philip turned to him and urged that this wasn't the time to head to the Jagan arena, suggesting they leave before things escalated further. But he ignored Philip's plea, rushing to Reina and calling her Katerina. He knelt beside her, asking worriedly if she was hurt and apologizing for losing control. Reina, trembling in fear, apologized to him instead. With wide, confused eyes, she asked him who he was. Her words left him stunned, frozen in disbelief. He stammered, asking her what she meant by who he was. However, she fearfully shouted at him not to come any closer. He tried to explain that he might look different and that she might not recognize him, but he could tell her everything. She interrupted him, saying it wouldn't be necessary, and asked what difference there was between him and the guards who had been abusing the children. He attempted to respond, but she cut him off again, telling him that he seemed to be mistaking her for someone else. She insisted that her name was not Katerina, but Reina. Philip quickly rushed over, trying to de-escalate the situation. He apologized to Reina, explaining that it seemed Simon had made a mistake. He assured her that they were not suspicious people and began to clarify their situation. Meanwhile, Simon looked down at his hand, feeling a pang of sadness. He remembered enduring countless hours of solitude, holding on to the knowledge that she would never come back. He now felt as if he had fallen apart simply because this woman resembled her. Suddenly, someone called out to Reina. A man approached her butler, Victor, and asked what she was doing. Victor sternly reminded her that she had something important scheduled for the day and asked if she realized how difficult it had been to find her. Reina started to respond, but Victor interrupted, angrily asking if she had been fighting with the guards again. He then turned his attention to Simon and Philip, asking who they were. Victor introduced himself, stating that this was their first meeting and apologizing for the circumstances. He asked them politely to refrain from getting too close to the princess. Simon scoffed, calling them all stupid. He turned to Reina and told her that, while it was true he had misunderstood and escalated the situation, the fact remained that he had helped her. He added that he hadn't done so expecting anything in return, but she could at least have said thank you. His words left her speechless. He turned to Philip, telling him it was time to leave, and walked away. Victor, seeing this, told Reina they should leave as well. She nodded, but as they left, she realized she hadn't thanked him. Later, they arrived at the Gigant Arena, where the host announced an intense match currently underway. Simon and Philip found seats with a clear view of the action. Simon observed the match, confidently predicting its outcome. As he expected, one of the Gigants defeated its opponent. The host announced the winner, Adolf. The crowd erupted into cheers. Philip turned to Simon, excitedly noting that his prediction was correct. At this rate, they would be able to pay off all their debts, and even strike it rich. Simon thought to himself that it was easy. He speculated that Gigants, being based on golem magic, revealed the flow of mana in a way he could easily interpret to determine the winner. The host then announced the next match, promising it would be a bloodbath, and the match would be Savage versus Sting. Philip told him that he thought he would be able to predict the next match too, and asked him how Sting, with 1 win and 5 losses, could possibly win against Savage, who had 28 wins and 2 losses. He told Philip that although it was possible to win, despite such a disadvantage in strength, it seemed that match would be trivial. The host then announced to look at the large axes because there hadn't been a single gigant able to take them down. He introduced the dual axe-wielding Savage and its rider Brian. The host then called Savage's opponent, who had miraculously taken a victory last time, which gained his attention. The host introduced the lucky gigant, Sting. Philip told him that it was quite a pity because Sting had managed to get a lucky win, but now he was facing Savage. While watching Sting with its rider Karen walk onto the stage, he smiled upon seeing it and ordered Philip to go all in on Sting. Philip was shocked and asked him what he was saying when Savage was guaranteed to win that match, but he just calmly replied that he wondered because he could see a different victor. That's all for today, guys. See you on the next upload.